Ooh, I am going to start recording now. And I think we can go ahead and get started and kick it off. Rachel Galanter is going to start us, but just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. You guys, the chat, you can send a chat message to everyone. If there's something that's more like technological that you need assistance with, feel free to email me, and my email is in the chat and I can put it there again, but it's Jenna, Jenna @betheldurham.org if there's something you don't want to send to the whole group. All the participants have been muted, and you will remain on mute. You won't be able to unmute yourselves. So if you have questions, put them in the chat or virtually raise your hand. You can also visually, I will try and keep my eyes out, but virtually is better, and you can do that on the participants list where you have that option. So Rachel, let's get us started.
So just a few more logistics to add to what you said. I want to thank Joyce Dworsky for doing ASL interpretation, and that if somebody wants to use that, you would need to set her to be your sort of primary speaker. And the way to make her video large enough to see is to pin her video, which means hovering over her video and clicking on the 3 dots and selecting pin video. And that we really appreciate Joyce providing this so that this conversation and experience is more accessible. So you are on mute, you will remain on mute. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. So at that time, you'll be able to raise your hand and be unmuted by the host, or type your questions into the chat box. And that Rabbi Graber and Rabbi Moskowitz got to know each other through the Hartman Institute, and there's a strong value to the connections made there. And before I do my introduction, Rabbi Graber wanted to say something right now.
Well, I just wanted to say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for joining us. Thank you to Rachel and many others who this was originally meant to be an in-person Scholar in Residence weekend. With coronavirus, this has been shifted to a Sunday morning Zoom conversation, but we don't view this as either or. And Rabbi Moskowitz, we hope that we will have the opportunity to welcome you and show you some Southern hospitality here in Durham, North Carolina at another date. Rachel will tell you more personally about Rabbi Moskowitz, but he has become a dear friend, and I'm just grateful for his friendship. I'm grateful for all of the holy work that he does in the world. And I also wanted to wish him Mazel Tov, because he recently was married, and just a beautiful moment in his life that I was sorry that we could not have more people around to festively dance, but to be married during coronavirus is not an easy task, but we wish you Mazel Tov. Thank you. And one last thing I do want to say, so Joyce Dworsky, who is signing for us, is the daughter of the late Leon Dworsky and Phyllis Dworsky. Joyce's mother passed away just in March, just as the coronavirus was striking in the world. And one of the last things that we did as a community is the funeral. They were able to come down to Durham and to have her mother buried in our cemetery. So we wish to Joyce just continuing nechama, continuing in the loss of her mother. And I just want to say what an enormous blessing her parents were for the Jewish community of Durham, helping to establish and build many of the institutions that we have, and really planting the seeds for us to be the amazing community that we have now. So with all that, I will turn it back to Rachel to officially introduce Rabbi Moskowitz, and I just want to say thank you and welcome to everybody this morning. This is a really great way for us to kick off or to celebrate June as Gay Pride Month. And Mike, you should know that we have a Pride March in September. It's a special thing here in Durham, but this is one of the special things that we like to do to mark this important month here in Durham.
Thank you to Rabbi Graber for his kind words of welcome for his friends, and Mazel Tov on your recent wedding. That's exciting. I want to just talk about a little about the community you're coming to, Bethel. When I moved here about 25 years ago, almost 25 years ago, it was incredibly welcoming to the LGBTQ community. The people who we knew who were involved with the Queer Jews and Friends Friday night potlucks went there. People seemed integrated into the community. It was just coming and wanting to teach in the Talmud Torah and lead children's programming. My being a lesbian was a non-issue. When I became president of Bethel, I was surprised that it continued to be a non-issue. I felt very fortunate at Bethel being a place that celebrated my wedding with me and my wife. And Bethel developed a reputation as the place for LGBTQ families when they were looking for a congregation or a Talmud Torah. I want to thank Koloteinu, who under Krisa's leadership has organized and sponsored Rabbi Moskowitz as a scholar in residence when that is possible to do. But also to acknowledge that Koloteinu isn't responsible for making Bethel welcoming. It's not their job to educate the congregation. It's really about people standing up as allies and holding each other accountable for making this a safe space and a welcoming space. The rabbi, well, not the rabbi, since we have two rabbis right now, Rabbi Graber had shared the story of the Midrash from the time of Solomon of the person with two heads, and that how you know they're one person is when you dump hot water on one head, they both cry out. That even though we don't all share the same thoughts, we have multiple heads, we do feel each other's pain, and that we have a responsibility to look out for our other heads, not just the one that shares our thoughts. Rabbi Moskowitz is a speaker who central to his Torah is the Torah of allyship. He's been a scholar in residence at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York. I'm very impressed by his photo of himself being arrested in his efforts to be an ally. It takes a certain confidence in yourself to make yourself vulnerable by putting yourself in the hands of a system that is not always responsible with its power, and that he chose to do that part of his allyship. We're fortunate to have him join us to share insight in the mitzvah of being an ally and to share with us a little bit of his special learnings, and that I'm very excited to introduce Rabbi Moskowitz.
Good morning, and thank you so much for the generous introduction. And Rabbi, it's just such an honor and pleasure to be with you and your community. I very much look forward to being able to be in person, God willing, soon in our days. Thank you all so much for having me this morning. I know that everybody has other places that they could be. My name is Rabbi Mike Moskowitz. My pronouns are he, him. I am the scholar in residence for trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is the world's largest LGBT synagogue. And it's a little bit awkward because I'm not trans and I'm not queer. But allyship often feels very awkward. Not just because it's predicated on the world being broken and people being dehumanized, that if that wasn't the case, others wouldn't need to step up, but also because of the excruciatingly exquisite and exacting sensitivity that's necessary to take up just the right amount of space. what can be affirming and validating for some can be equally traumatic and offensive to others. And so as much as intention matters, so too does the impact. And so what I want to just name at the very beginning is that allyship is tricky. And like so many new things, there's a learning curve. But what to me is the most important is that sense of anxiety of getting it wrong, which itself is a privilege to have that as our anxiety, is not nearly as awkward as the silence of doing nothing. We are responsible both for our actions and for our inactions. And just like the rabbi can tell you, when a person first approaches a text or the ability or has an opportunity to learn, it can be intimidating. The Gemara is a mixture of Hebrew and Aramaic. There's no punctuation, there's no capitalization. In fact, the Medrash tells us that two people can look at the text and one can say, it's just never going to happen. And another can say, okay, but there's a finite amount of words. If I learn 2 teachings today and 2 tomorrow, at some point I'll finish the whole thing. And that's why the Torah needs to say about itself that it's not in heaven. It's not on the other side of the world, it's on the other side of the ocean or in outer space, but rather it's something that is exceedingly close to us. And so too allyship. Reasonable people can look at this and say, listen, I'm just not a street activist. It's not who I am. And, I can't hold up a sign that says Black Lives Matter because I'm not Black. And like, it's not my lane. And I think up until recently, people would be very justified in saying like, yeah, you have a different lane and, the world's broken in a lot of ways and figure out a way that you can be constructive. But in my humble opinion, the only awkwardness now is in the awkwardness of doing nothing. I want to share a little bit about how I got into this work, some of the questions around gender and sexuality within the Jewish tradition that are very much alive right now in these conversations, and then share some insights which I think hopefully can provide a better outlook on how we can be allies both to communities of color, to every marginalized and oppressed community, and also particularly to the LGBT community. As we all know, when we talk about community, there's no Jewish community like there's no trans community, right? It's a bunch of people that can form groups, and as much as we might kind of self-identify in subcategories that separate us or put us in even smaller groups, when we use the term, it really just, it's meant to make things easier, not to be overly inclusive or exclusive. So I hope with an intention of compassion and forgiveness, we can all be a little bit more loose with some of the language, but it's also important to know that language is so important here, and that's one of the reasons why it's so tricky. So for me, like most people who do this kind of work full time, it's personal. It's really easy to hate people and things that you've never met or experienced. In fact, as a proof text, the brothers of Joseph seek to kill him, as the verse tells us that they saw him from afar. From a distance, right, people look less human. And so in the last 50 years, one of the observations that we've made around the progress of LGBT rights in relationship to race equality is that it's much easier to get to know someone and then find out they happen to be queer or trans than it is to meet somebody and then find out that they're a wonderful person when you've already come with those prejudices of seeing them as a person of color. And so the most important piece of all of this is to make it personal. And even if we in our own lives don't know that we know somebody in a marginalized community, if we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, we need to see all of God's children as siblings. And so it needs to be personal to us on a soul level, regardless of whether or not that person is somebody who we know. That is a person that God felt this world could not live without. And it's our responsibility to elevate the most pronounced identity of every human being as being created in the image of the Almighty. About 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now, I was a rabbi at Columbia University. I was a rabbi of the Old Broadway Synagogue in Harlem. And someone in my family said to me, I'm not a girl, I'm a boy. And I asked him, how do you know? I know how I'm a guy. Can't be the same way that you know that you're a guy. And he said, I just am. And since I was a kid and told which bathroom to use, I had never thought about my own gender identity, ever. And I was completely at a loss. I wanted to be supportive, but I had no idea how to do that. And it took me about 3 weeks speaking to everybody who would be willing to have a conversation with me about gender identity to reach what I think is a relatively evolved place of knowing that I just don't know. My experience as a cis person is on some level a just limited awareness of gender. I see my body, I know therefore what it tells me from my experience is that I'm a guy, and then I didn't think about it again. There is gender beyond the body, and for folks of trans experience, for gender nonconforming folks, for those who don't fit into the binary, there's an awareness of gender beyond the body. And so as an ally and as a cis person, I recognize that I just don't know what that's like. And for me, knowing that I don't know is actually from the place where I was able for the first time to generate thoughts and ideas. Because once I wasn't trying to understand the experience from the inside of like, what am I missing? How come I can't sense this? Then I was able to understand that like, it's actually not important for me to be able to have the experience of another, to be able to make sure that their experience is a safe one. And in fact, when the Torah was given, we just celebrated Shavuot, which I see as God's coming out speech. Right, the Torah says about itself that we all saw the sounds, that it was an experience of synesthesia, right? Normally we don't see sounds. And I think one of the reasons why that happened is that the Torah is telling us that, right, it's not just for your experience, but the Torah speaks to all expansive experiences beyond one's own lived. And so therefore, the Torah isn't just for straight folks, isn't just for cis folks, isn't just for white, right? All of those things that society has constructed as privileged are purely societal and have nothing to do with God or God's intentionality of creation. And so therefore, the Torah was given in the most expansive way because the Torah speaks to all experiences. And so I started getting involved very privately. I was writing for Keshet, which is a wonderful organization out of Boston. It's a national organization. They've got great resources. I was writing under a pseudonym. I was writing letters to day schools throughout the country that were threatening to throw out trans folks, trans kids. One of those letters got leaked. It was actually to a day school in the South, in Tennessee. And somebody posted it, and my employers told me that if I didn't stop, I wasn't going to be able to continue in the relationship that we had. And at the same time, about a year after the person in my family transitioned, I had a student at Columbia who had transitioned both from one gender to another, but also from secular to religious. Left the West Coast with one identity, got a haircut and packed new clothes for the airport, and landed on the East Coast, both presenting with a new gender, with a different gender, and also a religious identity. And I got a text from him one day that he was really struggling, that holding all of that, where nobody really knew, and the person passed very, very well, as being binary and cis and observant, that they were really struggling, and they weren't sure that they were going to be able to hold it all. Thank God that person is doing well, but it motivated me to take on the precarity, to really speak out very vocally. And I did in a speech on Hanukkah 3 years ago. And as a result, I lost both jobs shortly thereafter, and really found myself working in a deli in Lakewood, New Jersey, where I went to yeshiva. I couldn't find another job. People at that point already had known what I was doing. And this past December, I think, was 2 years, I was in DC at a protest for DACA at the Senate Rotunda, and got arrested with a bunch of other rabbis and lay leaders over this administration's posture towards Dreamers. And in the back of the police wagon, there are 5 male rabbis. There's a metal mechitza partition, and then 5 female rabbis on the other side. And this woman who's sitting across from me says, we're a bunch of rabbis. Does someone have any Torah? I have a very heavy accent. She actually said Torah, but that they want to share. And, we're all in handcuffs. It's a captive audience. And so I had just shared thoughts on an article I'd written on gender and clothing, reframing the prohibition around the biblical prohibition of wearing misgendered clothing. And that woman was Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. And through the course of the next several hours being in a warehouse where they also separated us by gender, she had heard a little bit of the story and also realized that she had read some of the things that I had written. And CVST got together and they created this position about 2 years ago. I've just finished now 2 years there, and I've published since I started around 80 articles at this intersection. That student told me that the message he wants the world to hear is that no one's life is ever hypothetical. As rabbis in particular, we're really good at asking theoretical questions. What happens if a person gets out of jail Erev Yom Kippur and there's only enough time to do one mitzvah, right? So the person should say the Shema, they should put on tzitzis or wear tefillin, right? So that's great in the world of ideas, but that doesn't have a pulse. And so the work that we have is to always remind ourselves that we're not answering questions, we're answering people, and that nobody's life is ever hypothetical. And so in talking about what happens when, right? So in this world of ideas that we're engaging in right now, it's always important to remind ourselves that this is not just an exercise of thought, that these thoughts matter and the way in which they manifest in the universe matters. Judaism is a religion of action, that we're meant to love peace, but we also have to pursue it. And so it's important to always remember that there are consequences, even the way in which we talk about things. So gender identity and sexual orientation are different. Who a person is when they go to sleep is different than who a person wants to sleep with. Someone who is asexual is not free from gender. And of course, they're related. The way in which we see gender roles in society and the way in which we see gender played out in society affects the way in which we name gender. It's much easier to name things which are socially constructions of gender, 70 cents in the dollar, right? Which evidently in Canada means something else. I spoke there recently when people could still get together. And when we think about where does gender really lie in its most essential way, certainly communities that have a posture of egalitarianism and second-wave feminism look to minimize those differences as inconsequential. But clearly for the trans experience and for genderqueer folks, right, if men and women are exactly the same, then there's no space to transition. And so there's this meta question about where gender lies. Is it possible for us to be able to identify a moment of transition on the spectrum where everybody's transition is different? From perhaps a name change and pronouns, maybe a haircut or wardrobe, maybe even hormones or surgery, where Jewish law can say, okay, at this point, we see you as this new identity. Perhaps maybe it's when the person realizes, right, who they are in terms of gender identity, perhaps when they're finished their transition. So again, those are interesting thoughts. I don't know that we have access to those, to that information. And it's also kind of irrelevant because the urgency of a person saying, you know, this is who I am, you know, I want to be able to be in relationship with God as my most authentic and genuine self, for a sanctuary to be that, a sacred space, to be able to hold as scaffolding the relationship between an individual and their creator, those questions don't need to be answered. But they do need to be answered, because when we have a tradition of gender-based spiritual practice, right, even in the conservative and the reform movement, the process of conversion is a different process for those who are male-identified and female-identified, right? Is circumcision gender-based in that a person who identifies as male needs to be circumcised, or is it body part specific, right? If a man of trans experience, somebody who transitions from female to male, gives birth, is that an affront to matrilineal descent? Is that gender identity, or is that body part specific? So these are complicated questions. You know, in most Orthodox synagogues, there's separate seating, right? So what happens for someone who doesn't fit into the binary? When done properly, it can, I believe, it can be very affirming and validating that even the space that a person is sitting in speaks to them and to the community, that they see them as the way in which they identify. But for other people, it can be deeply exclusionary and offensive. So the work, as it were, right now, for me, is in trying to minimize what's at stake. To say that differently, if we see that there's a need to be able to provide space for people to be who they are in relationship with God, so then what's at stake if we, as a community, see them as such? So if we think about the biblical prohibition of wearing misgendered clothing, the word that's used there is the word toeva, which is normally translated as an abomination. That's not what the word means. It's the same word that we find in the biblical prohibition that the verse says that a man shouldn't be with another man the way in which he's with a woman. It's also the same word that's used in Hebrew to describe just owning unfair weights and measures, right? If a person inherited weights from an ancestor where one is heavier than the other, depending if they're buying and selling as a way of cheating people, just owning them is called a toeva. And so the Gemara itself says, right, that the word speaks to a person who's making a mistake and erring in being dishonest and unfaithful. So when we think about the trans experience, very often that verse of wearing misgender clothing is what's brought down as a way of justifying transphobia. But if we see within the commentaries, we have a ubiquitous custom of people wearing misgender clothing on Purim, where we dress up. And so if it was a biblical prohibition, right, you can't do that. And so the medieval commentator Rashi explains that the verse there is using the word abomination as a condition, that when a person dresses up in order to do something licentious and nefarious, so that is biblically prohibited. It's analogous to a person who's not a doctor dressing up as a doctor to gain access to patients, right? So there's nothing wrong with being a doctor. There's nothing wrong with dressing up as a doctor. The prohibition becomes obvious when a person is looking to get access to intimate spaces in a way that's dishonest and misrepresenting who they are. So the same thing is true for somebody who's queer and is presenting as straight and is being unfaithful with their wife to be with another man, right? Which is the framing of the biblical prohibition in a heteronormative way. And that's how the Gemara understands that men are making a mistake by leaving their wives. So we find this also in rabbinic literature about two women, that the Code of Jewish Law says a husband should warn his wife not to be with other women. And it doesn't say that mothers should warn their daughters or teachers should marry their students. And the common thread in all of this is that a person in such a situation could think to themselves, being with a woman is not real. It's not real marriage. It's not a real relationship. It's not real intimacy. And so therefore I'm not being unfaithful. And so what the Code of Jewish Law is saying and correcting that is that no, if you want to be with another woman, right, and you're in a monogamous exclusive relationship, then you can't be with your husband, because that is being unfaithful. That is cheating. That is not being authentic and genuine in that relationship. And so we find this word as an abomination is actually a deviation of truth. And so unfortunately what's happened in homophobic places, right, is that sense of that predominant tool of homophobia has actually forced and created the structure to support the biblical prohibition. Because if men were able to say, listen, I'm gay, so why in the world would I marry a woman? I'm not attracted to her, right? Because no person would want someone who they care about to be married to somebody who couldn't find them attractive. So the fact that the person is saying it's not that it's this person specific, it's gender specific, that shouldn't make it, right? So in that way, society, right, and that homophobia is the abomination. And the verse isn't really speaking about, right, two people who happen to love each other and be of the same gender. So part of the work right now is in really recognizing, giving language to that there's never a prohibition of being. And at Hartman, we talk a lot about kind of this incremental change of the phrase that they use there is a intolerable deviancy, right? If a person wanted to speak up, come to a community and speak about Jews for Jesus, most American institutions, Jewish institutions would say like, this is just like not the place for that, right? And so there's an intolerance, as probably there should be for that. And it's not an affront to interfaith dialogue, but in terms of missionizing, right, there's a time and a place. So we then have this other kind of space along the spectrum of tolerable deviancies, which is in Orthodox circles probably where we are. And as much as offensive as that is, I think it's really necessary as a mark along the spectrum of gradations to get to a place of acceptance and celebration. And I think that's one of the important lessons that needs to be really internalized, especially in conversations about politics, and both on the far right and the far left, is that there's this kind of urge that it's an all or nothing and a fight to kind of burn it all down. In far right-wing, even religious spaces, there's this tendency to be strict. And then anyone who's not the most strict is not strict at all and has not even met the basic threshold. And so too in the far left, right? If a person doesn't want to just burn it all down, right, then there's no space to have a conversation, right? For example, around immigration, right? Some people feel like ICE needs to be reformed, right? The organization that's been tasked recently in torturing and caging humans in the name of immigration, right? Others feel that it needs to be abolished, right? Okay, so there are things that reasonable people can disagree about, right? As long as at the core they want the same things, then there can be space to disagree on how to achieve that. For example, I know it's the South, but I'm sure people here have different views on firearms, right? Some people might argue more guns, less violence. Others might argue less guns, less violence, right? As long as everybody agrees we want less violence, right, and no violence, and the children should be able to go to school and not worry about being shot, so then reasonable people can have an intelligent conversation that's data-driven about what's the best way to go forward. But unfortunately, what happens in many spaces is that there's no, it's not a safe space to have a conversation that holds the complexity that we don't have answers to all of the questions. So part of allyship is a recognition of this is where we are right now. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but we want to advance the cause. So what are practical steps that we can take, right, that are not going to solve all of the issues, but can make it, move it from bad to good? So it's tricky. It's tricky because when a person says, listen, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm capable of doing, that might not be, in the eyes of others, perceived as good enough. But if we think about the way in which we see ourselves in terms of our spiritual identity, I found that it's been very helpful in giving that as a point of reference for others. So to take just a breath for a second, because I know that's a lot of words, I want to try to make this a little bit easier to understand. When we think about gender identity, we have in our tradition an awareness of spirituality that exists on a soul level, right? God created us in God's image, but God doesn't have an image. God, I believe, is the source of all gender, and certainly has gendered attributes within our tradition. But what does that mean for God to be gendered when God doesn't have a body or an image? So the very first person that was created, our rabbis tell us, was created in the image of God, and then was split into a binary of male and female. And then we all are descendants and unique blends of all of those things, holding different fragments and sparks with a greater expression and dominant expressions of different attributes, which for some are very fixed, that we feel pretty consistent, both spiritually and in terms of our gender identity. For others, perhaps when the rabbi gives a good drasha, right, a person feels aroused spiritually, a person feels animated and passionate and feels a dominant expression of spiritual identity that can motivate into actions. Hopefully that's the way in which we feel, and hopefully that kind of awareness of a soul level is something that can guide us in every moment of the day. But for some folks, that's not the experience. Some of us were assigned Jewish at birth, others not. Some felt that who they are really at their core is a member of the Jewish people, and they chose to be part of the Jewish people, and they converted. The Zohar, the early mystical work, explains that the term that we use for a convert in Hebrew is the ger shenesgayer, the convert who converted. It's not the non-Jew who converted, because our tradition teaches that that person was always a convert, meaning that person was always part of the Jewish people. Their soul was at Mount Sinai. So it's similar in terms of gender identity, that a person could be assigned one gender, they transitioned to another, but there was an awareness for some that this is who they always were. And the transition is just about letting the world know who they are. For others, it wasn't that way. A person felt one way and they transitioned. There's no right or wrong way to feel spiritual, to feel gender, or to feel the way in which that a person presents needs to be done in a particular way. For me, as somebody who identifies as traditional in a pretty fundamental way, I see the Torah being eternal and infinite, immutable, and as a result of my belief system that God gave the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, on Mount Sinai, that it speaks to every single generation equally, the call to action now is not about inventing or creating as much as it is to uncover and discover, because I believe that if the Torah is eternal and infinite, that God had a conversation with Moses on Mount Sinai about LGBT issues. And so it's really for us to reach within the tradition to be able to find language. In fact, the Hebrew word for ally, I think, is one that most people here probably are familiar with. I think the Hebrew word for ally is what we translate as friend, chaver. The word chaver literally means to attach. It gets its name from the hooks in the tabernacle, which were known as the Vavei HaMishkan. They attached the pillars to the curtains. It's the sixth letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The Vav is vertical with a little hook, it actually looks like a hook and its utility is one of connecting. So too in grammar, it's the conjunction and. The letter vav connects one word to the other by the use of being and in addition to. Someone who is an author is a machaber. They are attaching thoughts and words to paper. If something is attached to the ground, it's mechuber lekarka. So the word chaver is really, it's about attaching. And allyship is that process of taking the resources of often a socially constructed privilege and networking it to another, whether that means white folks standing in front of people of color in a march because white lives in this country do matter, and white people do not get shot by police the way in which people of color do. Whether that means, taking the privilege and the agency that we have and amplifying that first person narrative. There is no substitute to have somebody tell their story. It's what makes it personal. And so much of the work is trying to get people who are in spaces of segregation to be able to hear and get access to the people whose lives matter and whose stories are not being told or whose voices are not being heard. And so that is the struggle, and it's super tricky because you can't force someone to be your friend. You can't fiat attitude. All you can do is try to be friendly to somebody and hope that they reciprocate. In fact, the very famous story with the convert and Hillel, when he wants to know the entire Torah on one foot, Hillel says to him, what your friend doesn't like, don't do. And Rashi, the medieval commentator on the side of the Gemara, says, who's your friend? Your friend there is God. So in our partnership with God, right, what is important to God, we're supposed to make what's important to us. And in terms of allyship, what's important to those who are being marginalized, being oppressed, that's what we need to make important to us. I got arrested again not that long ago when people could still be out and protesting. It was outside of an ICE detention center. And I've been to Mexico and I went to the detention centers there, on both sides of the border in Texas and in New Mexico and Arizona. And it's horrific. And deep within our tradition, we know what it's like to be enslaved. We know what it means to be oppressed. We know what it's like to be dehumanized. That's perhaps the most frequently quoted text in our liturgical service of Zeichel Yetzias Mitzrayim, that we're supposed to remember the Exodus of Egypt, right? Because we were there and we know what that's like, and we know what it's like when nobody cares. And now that we're in a place of a different type of freedom, we have a responsibility to take that privilege and to be able to harness it and leverage it, to be able to make sure that it doesn't happen to anybody else, because it doesn't make a difference. As soon as we start distinguishing between our children and their children, we're denying the reality that they are all God's children. So I want to pause. I think I've been speaking for about 30 minutes, but I would love to try to engage in a little bit more of a dialogue, answer people's questions. The simple things of what can people do is that we all need a better education, right? There's some wonderful books about, the new Jim Crow, about racism today. It's not difficult to find them. For folks who want to get a little bit more active, but don't feel comfortable for whatever reason going to the streets, having a book club, where the people of color and other marginalized segments of society can be part of that conversation for those who feel resourced and nourished. In doing so, our tradition teaches Hamanti Kiani Adaber, right? That the more that we talk about something, the more real it becomes, the more we are able to believe it. There are really good people out there that just have never been exposed to the struggles of those who are in different parts of society. And it's not a judgment, but our tradition also says in the measures, Einata L'Tshuva, that we think about now. The question is always, now what, right? So the fact that we didn't do this yesterday, right, or the day before, doesn't at all mean that we can't do something today. Also, there's wonderful organizations that are doing this work on the ground level for a really long time. If you're in a place to support them financially, that's a really easy way of helping people be able to do this. I have about 80 articles on my website for those who are interested in more specific details of a lot of these issues of allyship. And the most important thing is really to form relationships. To make it personal, to try to get to know people that maybe aren't in your inner circle. If you think about who your closest 5 or 10 friends are, they all are like kind of very similar in the way in which they identify. It might be worth trying to expand outward to try to get to know people of different experiences, because our tradition teaches that when we want to understand God, the more that we're able to understand and see people who present differently than we are, the more we're able to actually see different facets of the divine. I will just end with one last kind of teaching on this that to me resonates very much. The Gemara asks, now that the temple's been destroyed, that God doesn't have an address physically anymore, where do we find, God? And the Gemara acknowledges that we've forced God back into the closet. Both in the original sin, when God told us what was important to God, and God set boundaries, and we had issues with consent. So too, after the God's coming out speech, just 40 days later, we're serving a golden calf. And I think from God's perspective, God's struggling that I told you who I am, right? I am Hashem your God. I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt. Why aren't you believing me? Why can't you see me the way in which I see myself, and how could you possibly deny my existence by serving this false God? The need for us to be seen and understood is not part of the human experience. It actually emanates from the divine. The emptiness and void, the Medrash tells us in the Genesis narrative, was actually God's loneliness. It's not good for us to be alone because we're created in the image of God. It's not good for God to be alone because God is the ultimate giver, and you can't give if you're all by yourself. So the more that we're able to see other people, the more we're able to see God, the more we're able to benefit other people, the more we're able to mimic the divine. So again, thank you so much for this invitation, and would love to hear questions that folks have, both on allyship broadly or questions in the LGBT community, or in any way that I can be supportive.
Thank you so much. Guys, you will see that you are muted and you won't be able to unmute yourself, so you have to raise your hand virtually is the easiest way. If you go to participants, there is option to raise hand, and that's easy. You can wave your hand physically, and I can try and see if I can see you, but there's a lot of boxes. And then, of course, there's the chat as well. Okay, Jacob has a question, so I'm going to
Wow. Just that was a lot of beautiful teaching that it can take me a while to really put into my soul. Not a question. I just want everyone to know that the LGBT Center of Raleigh has been doing so much support for the protesters on the streets right now in Raleigh. And if you want to find where to donate, they're supporting work of the protesters and the queer people in the Triangle region. The LGBT Center of Raleigh is amazing work. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. We also have a question in the chat from Norma that says, Rabbi, where do you find your spiritual home at this time based on your current teachings?
Thank you. King David writes in Psalm 23, even in the valley of the shadow of death, Ki ata imadi, because God is with me. And I think if a person is able to feel like they're walking with God, they're in like fantastic company. So I think part of the work is finding the good that exists in a lot of places. And so as much as I don't have a community yet that sees the world in similar enough ways that the spiritual practice of prayer supports mine and the progressive values support mine, I do find a lot of goodness in a lot of places. So, I still am very much in conversation and community with my yeshivas and people from, I learned in the Mir in Jerusalem and in Lakewood, and BMG and Base Mensch in Lakewood. And so I still have friends that I speak to and learn with. Although I don't necessarily pray in those spaces because of their posture towards trans folks and other things. And I also find myself in really, in non-Orthodox spaces where I don't pray in them, but I do find the great, wonderful, enthusiasm and passion and teaching and community in that way. So I would say like they're wonderful nuggets of greatness everywhere. We're supposed to learn from everybody. And so right now I feel nourished by having, wonderful relationships with people who often see different aspects of the world differently, and that's okay.
I think, was that the Mandels have their hand raised? I'm coming at you. Hold on. And then unmute.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Rabbi, very much for giving us this opportunity to learn. And second question, maybe more for Jenna, but if we wanted to pass this on to one of our children or more than one of our children to listen to what we just were able to listen to, how would we do that?
Well, in terms of this talk specifically, Bethel, we have it recorded and we will share that out. But Rabbi Moskowitz, maybe you can talk a little more about your book that's coming out and the book that's out and your website and where to find some of your teachings.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a book called Textual Activism. It's available right now actually only on Amazon. And it's a collection of articles. It's organized by topic in interfaith spaces and allyship and spiritual practice, and also through the calendar year. And a lot of those articles are available for free on my website. You're welcome to read them for free. You don't have to buy the book. My new book that I'm working on, and God willing will be out in time for Hanukkah, is on graceful masculinity. I'm very much obsessed in trying to explore gender within our tradition, and society has great language for the negative ways in which masculinity presents, toxic masculinity, mansplaining, manspreading, all of those things. But it's not bad to be a guy. It's just it's important to get it right. And so I see gender as attributes, and I see everybody as having all of these kind of attributes in different ways. And so this book is a weekly kind of discussion on graceful masculinity in the Torah portion. If folks are interested, some of them are on. But the first one that I wrote was last year, actually, in Parshas Nasa, what we just had, about seeing the blessings that Aaron gives to his sons, of the Kohanim, where it says Vichunaka, as a response to the jealousy of the person who wants his wife not to be secluded in ways. And so there's an article there called Graceful Masculinity that I wrote for Brandeis, has a Institute for Gender Studies with Hadassah. So to get a flavor for that, that's a good article that's relevant for this time of the year. And the website is rabbimikemoskowitz.com. There's a link for the book there, but there's also a place for, there's articles, and there are also some videos of speeches at protests.
And I did drop rabbimikemoskowitz.com in the chat box for you guys. We've had a couple of great comments, and then one question that got a +1 and amen, which is, Rabbi, this is from Laura Flicker and Elliot Levitt. Rabbi, what are your thoughts about intersectionality in progressive movements now? Does it pose opportunity or threat to Jewish allyship?
It's a great question. Like all of this, it's tricky. I would say, as a rule, to the extent that anything kind of unites people, it's good. To the extent that it excludes people, it's bad. I read a study once that said 9 out of 10 people, when their favorite sports figure gets traded to their least favorite team, can no longer have that player as their favorite player, because now they're on their least favorite team. So I don't know that that's good for the universe, because, right, who has gotten it right? Who is free from criticism? Who has figured it all out in a way that's perfect? Nobody. And so I think being able to name the deficiencies in things and the way in which things often have unintended consequences is really important, but that it can't get in the way of rallying behind the things that we both agree. So without being political, and you can't not be political even by naming it, right? But let's just take Israel for an example, right? So even saying Israel as opposed to Palestine means different things to different people. If we talk about the occupation, if we talk about the Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, like the land that God gave the Jewish people, all of that is very charged. I'll share one quick thought on pride and Israel and Zionism. I'm not a Zionist in the way in which I think probably most people who are Zionists identify as Zionism, because in my world, Zionism replaced religiosity, and the idea of religious Zionism is something that I think my world hasn't yet wrapped its head around. So none of these words are meant to be persuasive or offensive, but just as a point of reference. Herzl has perhaps the most famous quote that, right, if you will it, it's not a dream. And we have something very similar in the Jewish tradition from the Chidah. The Chidah, who lives before him but not by much, says, that nothing stands in front of a person's desire or will. And the commentators ask, like, what does that mean? We have in the Jewish tradition an idea of ones, right? A person can be exempt from something because it was beyond their control, right? You're supposed to wanted to go daven in the morning, your alarm didn't go. It's like not your fault. So why don't we see that as you didn't want it enough? So there's a really interesting mystical teaching that's brought down at the beginning of the Genesis narrative, where two of God's names are deployed in the beginning of creation in the same verse. And the medieval commentator Rashi points out that God wanted to create this world through a strict attribute of judgment. And therefore the word Elohim is God's name of judgment is there. But then God saw that it wasn't actually going to be able to be sustainable. So God created first this world through Racham and mercy, and that's why God's other name is there. And the Sfas Emes, one of the Ger Rebbes, gives a really beautiful and practical framing that to this day, when it comes to wanting something, there is still that strict attribute of judgment. Because how do you defend wanting to be obnoxious? How do you defend wanting to hurt somebody's feelings, right? How can you defend not wanting to be healthy? You want to know why in the world of reality, of action, I'm not healthy? Because there's all you can eat buffets and I don't sleep enough, right? And the gym's closed, right? In the world of action, there's a lot of reasons why. And so for that, there's mercy. So what I would say is, in the world of wanting, do you want the land of Israel to be one where people are free, people have access to resources, people can get along, and people can live in peace? Like, if you want that, if that's what you want, some sort of coexistence, then like we can have a conversation. But it says, no, actually, I think that certain people, choose your people, right? But I think that certain people are actually not people, and I don't care. And I don't want, like, those things aren't important to me. If they're alive, they're dead, it's not significant to me. Okay, so we actually want different things, and we can't have a conversation. So in terms of intersectionality, right? Things are connected. The one thing we know about God is that God is one, right? When there's unity, there's holiness. There can be unity, and we can embrace a commonality of individuality. Being different is not at all a contradiction to being together. And I think the more space there is for differences within that unity is to the extent that we can actually have the most holistic and complete both the vision of God and peace in this world. The world for peace and the word for whole, shalom and shalem, are the same. So by excluding people because they don't fit my narrow space, nobody in the world sees the world that I do, the way that I do exactly. And the way that I see the world today is different than yesterday, right? The awkwardness of allyship is actually, for me, I think, becoming less awkward. Like, how are you not an ally? Like, it's awkward not, like, right? But that's different than yesterday, right? Which is different than the day before. So if even one person with the same parents, the same first 40 some years together, right, can change from day to day as we should, as we evolve and mature, there just needs to be more space. So in short, it's all true, it's all connected, and we need to make more inviting and welcoming spaces. Just to say something, when I was a rabbi at Columbia, we had an Ivy League clergy meeting once, and a woman of color from Princeton said that there's a difference between being invited and being welcomed, right? Because everyone's invited, right? But there's a difference there, and there's some space between being invited and welcomed. And I think that's where it gets tricky, because we can want to have interfaith dialogue and we can invite people to the table, right? But are they there because we can't have a table without them, right? Like that's another way of objectifying a person and tokenizing a person and dehumanizing a person, right? I don't want to be somebody's token Orthodox friend. Like, that's not who I am, right? I'm a person who happens to be. So in kind of narrowing that space from like checking the boxes off to actually feeling a sense of responsibility, which again, we learned this from Abraham, right? Like, having a tent with doors open on all sides. It was about, he was attracted to the stranger, right? He didn't want to convert them to not be who they are. He just wanted to expand the vision that there's, monotheism in the world, and then people can go about their business.
Rabbi, I am going to call on Sky, who has a question, but also in the chat, someone mentioned, maybe we could all put our pronouns and rename our names to put our pronouns, and I can talk to the logistics of that, but wondering if you could talk to that practice. And
sure. So I every time I change my name on this thing, it goes back. I'm not good with this stuff, and so like the absence of it there is not because I don't think it's important. It's just because I don't even know how to capitalize my own name or put an R for rabbi. So in that way, I'm not modeling this great, but I do always name my pronouns, in part to destigmatize it, and also in part to normalize it. I don't want people to assume anything about me. And certainly, look, I got an award at a Pride thing in Jersey a couple of years ago, and people called the police on me because they thought I was there for a counter protest. So people judge, and that's part of the problem, is that we come with those prejudices. That's why there hasn't been the progress for race relations in the last 50 years the way there has been for LGBT things, like we said earlier. And so I think it's just a great way of modeling. I don't get mistaken for a woman ever. I have been, asked if I'm trans many times. And it's like an offensive question. And nobody should be asked these types of things. And so I name the pronouns and also name being cis and straight, because people assume if I'm in this position, I must have some sort of connection to it in terms of lived experience. And that's not a bad assumption, but I think when people don't have to make assumptions, that's really great. And when we can empower people to not just control their own narratives, but have their voice amplified, there's a way in which I think it helps people perhaps feel confident enough to say other things that they think it's important for them, for the world to know about them.
Thanks. And Sky, wait. Okay, Sky, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much, though, for the speech and everything. I have a question, though. As a trans person who would like to be more observant, do you have any, advice, I guess, kind of?
Sure. The most important thing to realize is that God does not make mistakes, and God does not put extra people in this world. So God needs you, God wants you, God loves you, we see you, we need you, we want you. So I think the advice is, to follow that sense of spiritual guidance, the way in which you were able to be sensitive to your own gender identity, be aware and sensitive to that spiritual identity. I'm sure you know the rabbi, and if you don't know the rabbi, I can tell you he's a great rabbi. Observance is really about trying to be in a healthy relationship with God. So what do you think God wants from you? So in all relationships, and I think, our tradition provides the details of that relationship. So, being religious, I don't know, is a goal. Being observant, I don't know, is a goal as much as being in a healthy relationship with God is, I think, very much the goal. And, for me, that looks like a certain thing. For you, it will look different, only because what you think God wants from you is going to be predicated on what your unique life experiences are. So, look at, kind of spiritual evolution as a continuation of self, right? What does it look like to be able to manifest even more of yourself, to be more present with God, to be more conscious of God? Just like social consciousness is necessary for spiritual practice, so too is self-consciousness, right? The more aware we are of who we are allows us to be guided more effectively and efficiently in relationship with God. And so maybe one more finer point, to the extent that there's something that you can offer, right, the world that nobody else can, is a really good indicator that that's where you should focus. This is the advice that Hillel gives, Imin ani li mili, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? And what that means on a deeper level is that there's nobody else who is me, right? So we all have something that nobody else can bring. Sometimes that means because of our proximity to a person in terms of relationship, where their neighbor, right, where their co-worker, where their family, or their friend, right, and we're in a unique position because of that proximity. And sometimes it's because of our unique life experiences. And so, the world would be incomplete without you being present. Your community would be incomplete without you being present. So what does it look like for you to offer as full as possible that which nobody else can bring to the table? Like, set up a meeting with the rabbi. And is that helpful? I don't mean to be
Yes.
vague and ambiguous.
No,
it's
it's very helpful.
Yeah. And you can always email me also. I'm happy. If there's ever anything I can be to be supportive, know that I'm here.
Thank you.
I know that Rabbi Graber has a question because he always does, but I'm also I'm looking around. I don't see anyone else. So Rabbi Graber.
So I want to say one thing, which is that Mike, Rabbi Moskowitz, is an incredibly generous soul and generous with his time. Sometimes I worry about him and think that he's being too generous with his time and needs to really remember what Hillel said, that self-care is part of this whole thing. But he has given of his time to people in our congregation who have questions, both in terms of their own sexual identity and relationship with Judaism and God, and also who have family members, children and spouses and others who are doing this, and for whom it's a confusing experience. And so I just want to echo what he said, although I don't want to put too much call on his time, but he's an amazing person, and to whatever extent I can be of support and a resource, I try to know the things that I know and know the things that I don't. But I do just want to say that for me it's an honor to be support and for people in their relationship with God and Judaism, and I want to try to do that as much as I can as well. The question that I wanted to ask Rabbi Moskowitz, I'm very proud, and as Rachel described at the beginning, I inherited a community that has a history of being an incredibly welcoming place for the LGBTQ community. I hope that that's something that I have continued to steward and lift up and carry on. But nobody's perfect, number one, and nobody knows everything. And you have this amazing view of the entire Jewish world, and seeing what are good and smart things that good organizations, that good communities do. And so I would just love to hear from you. Are there 1, 2, 3 just really, really smart and important things that synagogue communities, that we as a community can do to be a place that is, like you said, that doesn't only issue an invitation, but that is truly welcoming and accepting of people for who they are?
It's a great question. Thank you. And I think, your community is really lucky in that your empathy and caring comes across really, like I've experienced it at Hartman, where you're like, hey, did you sleep last night? Like, I care. It's really obvious that you care. And so your community is really lucky. I think there are some really kind of basic things, just like the mezuzah on the doorpost lets the passerby know that this is a Jewish institution. Signage, flags, it's a really great nonverbal message that this is a safe space. And one of the things around allyship is that it's important never to view checking the boxes oh, so we have a sign, we have a flag, so we're good, right? Having resources, all gendered bathrooms, right? Or gender neutral bathrooms, right? The anxiety, you have these already? It's great. So
we just did a whole remodel, and that was
fantastic.
Something that we definitely have front and center.
So beyond the obvious of the practical, it's really important. It's also such a powerful message, right? It's such a powerful nonverbal message that you're putting the needs of others, in the way in which you're functioning. So CBST has the most pinned, evidently, bathroom in New York City, because all of our bathrooms are all gender bathrooms. Amy Schumer, actually just right before we shut down, filmed a commercial in our bathrooms, which was really just, my office is right by the bathrooms. Everybody's upstairs and it's 3 floors. I'm the only one who has an office downstairs, probably because they didn't have an office for me when they hired me, and also it's a space for books. And they want me just to sit and write and learn, so it's good that I'm not interrupted, and I hate meetings. But so that was an interesting experience. But they needed to get new ordinances passed to be able to have all gender bathrooms in New York City. And it's on the tour that we give of the building. It's an important piece of it. I think also providing resources for the specific needs of marginalized segments of society. So, for example, this past summer, so generally when I go to a community, I try to get tested for HIV, in a public way. I encourage other people to do it because it's about destigmatizing. It's about, normalizing, and it's just important to know your status. And so like modeling those things, whenever an institution that has some resources is able to support those organizations locally that struggle, and often clinics are some of those places, having, once a week, once a month, being able to partner with organizations to provide perhaps space or volunteers to help those organizations, kind of narrow some of those gaps can also be really helpful. Also recognizing on the calendar, World AIDS Day, things which, all right, and not just that, but also like, Black History Month. There are things in general, and again, it's not about minimizing it that like, well, 1 month a year we do this, but it's recognizing that for some folks, right, like in our calendar, there are different days of the year that actually provide unique opportunities to work on very specific aspects of our spiritual identity. And so too, in the secular calendar, there are days on the calendar that are helpful in trying to bring awareness and to things which are important for social consciousness. So looking at the calendar is really important. To the extent that there are, people that are given space, right, during Pride Month, to have people, of queer experience, of, from the LGBT community, to be able to have a space of real dialogue, of hearing from people what their needs are. There's nothing in allyship that's more important than listening, humble listening, active listening. But if you don't have a space for people to come and talk, then the fact that you might be available for listening is not helpful because no one's coming to talk to you. So thinking about, what are ways that we can really not just invite conversation, but foster it, right? Who can we have that can hold us accountable? Who can we be in partnership with to be able to give feedback in present tense? This is so tricky, this work. I mean, I don't even have in my own memory and experience where I feel like I got this right? Like we try, it's aspirational as it is elusive, even for seasoned kind of professionals, because nobody has universal appeal. And so having multiple points of entry into these conversations is also important, right? There are some people who won't speak to somebody who's straight about these things, or people who won't speak to somebody who, right? So being able to have, when you think about hiring people, which I think at some point the world will think about hiring people again, hopefully, what does the staff look like? How diverse is it? If you have two people who are equally qualified, it gets tricky, right? They're competing interests, but like thinking about modeling the diversity that you're trying to represent is also super helpful. And those of course are more complicated. What does your library look like? In terms of the one in the synagogue, do you have queer authors? Do you have, there's a protest going on outside. Do you have, queer, authors? Do you have children's books that have two mommies or two tatis, two fathers, right? Do you have, things, for gender queer folks? When we talk about even just the language, when we think about, please rise, right? For those who are able-bodied, right? In body or in spirit. When we think like ladies and gentlemen, or brothers and sisters, do we mention siblings, right? Do we break the binary? Are we sensitive, in these types of ways? It can be exhausting to have to constantly filter, like, okay, if I say this, who will be offended? Can I use the word Israel? Can I not? Right? But there are things that we are passionate enough about that we say, like, if I can't talk about this, then what am I doing? And I think that, we're at a time that, a year ago, I think most white folks would have felt uncomfortable holding a sign that says Black Lives Matter, because that's not our lane. But things change, and things change quickly. So having within the structure of the synagogue a way to kind of refresh, to be able to speak in present tense, because the contours of this are also changing. Meaning, if you look at like pamphlets on LGBT inclusivity from like 10 years ago, it's just not 5 years ago, right? It's changing really quickly. Even there was a phase when people said, my preferred pronouns are, right? And then people were like, it's not a preference, right? And so then like that got jettisoned, right? And so not being dissuaded by not getting it perfect, recognizing that perfect today cannot possibly be perfect tomorrow, because this world really is changing so very quickly. And so just recognizing it, naming it, and really making people feel that you're there to listen about how to do this better. The commitment is to the process. Nobody is perfect, but the more inviting of the feedback, I think the more that can, kind of influence the actions moving forward.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to wrap it up in just a moment. One thing I just want to say, Krisha, who has been the head of our Koloteinu group, said just messaged me, I want to echo Jacob's plug for the Raleigh LGBTQ Center, but also make sure that folks are familiar with the LGBTQ Center of Durham as well. So we have a blessing of riches to have two of those centers, in both communities. And I just want to say thank you to Rachel, who was a synagogue president with me during my tenure as the rabbi, and who's just been a wonderful friend and partner at Bethel, and for helping me in the process of my own growth and understanding. And I'll turn it back over to her to wrap up.
So I want to thank Rabbi Moskowitz for his teaching, and to everyone who came and spent their time for doing at least a little something to commemorate Pride. I hope you enjoyed my little flags. And to be mindful of what are the steps in allyship you personally feel like you can take. And I encourage you to try easy, right? That I think that there's a point where it feels like, oh, that's too much. I can't do that. But what is the point where if you're trying easy, there's something you could do now, right? Lo akshav matai. If not now, when? What is that one step, whether it's being more conscious of your language, or introducing yourself with pronouns, or asking people for their pronouns, or introducing a different book into your library, or putting some signage up that makes it clear that you're welcoming a certain kind of conversation, or for people to just have that visual, hey, this is a safe, inviting space for you. Or choosing to make sure that you're in dialogue with people, whether that starts with you reading a book or joining a book group. What is that one step of allyship that you are willing to take? And then what is, as a congregation, as we're thinking about this, what are the steps that we want to take? And I hope to be part of those conversations with you. And we are really appreciative of Mike Moskowitz of helping us start thinking through what are some of those opportunities. Yasher Koach and Mazel Tov on behalf of myself and Bethel.
Thank you so much. And Rabbi, again, thank you for this invitation. Thank you to the staff and Jenna. We've had many conversations. It's an amazing team. You're really lucky to have them. They're really lucky to have you. We are all in this together. It's really important that we show God how much we love God by loving all of God's creations. And thank you so much. Thank you all so very much for all of the love and the dances and the mazel tovs.
And the way we like to clap on mute is
fantastic.
with some good jazz hands.
Very much looking forward to celebrating together, God willing, in person, and being able to share in simchas moving forward. So again, thank you all so very much. Rabbi, always a pleasure. Thank you to all the new friends, and stay strong.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Boker tov.